We're looking at the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is written to give us wisdom. We've talked a little bit about what wisdom is. Now, why is getting wisdom so important? I mean, we've got this whole set of books, wisdom literature, like Proverbs, and they're written by wise men to give us wisdom. But why is getting wisdom so important? Three reasons. First, it's important because you don't naturally have wisdom. Not the kind that Solomon is talking about. Otherwise, he wouldn't write the book. He writes this book to know wisdom. If you knew wisdom automatically, he wouldn't have to write it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have to keep saying throughout the book stuff like what we read in Proverbs 1:8. Hear, my son. And that little phrase is everywhere. And it's everywhere because Solomon knows you need instruction if you're going to become wise. If you just sit there and don't receive outside input from God on how to live life, you're not naturally going to be very good at living. That's why Solomon says stuff like Proverbs 3:13, blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding. Or chapter 4, verse 5, get wisdom, get insight. And he says it because you don't automatically come out of the womb having it. Wisdom is something you have to find. It's something you have to learn. And while that's so obvious, it's such an important concept. I have a number of children, and one thing that I've noticed about children is they often want to be good at something right away. I'm a little like that myself, actually. So it's not just children. If we play basketball, they want to be great at basketball right away. If we draw, they want to be great artists right away. And I have to tell them repeatedly that's not usually how life works, because either what happens is they're proud and they think they know what they're doing when they don't. They're like, I don't need help, when they actually do. Or if they're not proud, they give up after they try because they're not as good as they thought they would be right away. And they just say, I can't do it. And so I have to encourage them. Life doesn't usually work that way. It doesn't usually work that way with skills like cooking or sewing or playing sports. And it doesn't work that way with life itself. Living life well is a skill. And if you don't humble yourself and seek to learn from God how to live life well, it's likely you're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. And as you look out at people whose relationships are going well, or they're doing better at their work or whatever, it's not always just luck, of course. There's providence that plays a part, but it's not always luck. Sometimes it's because they've learned wisdom. And that's one reason the study of the book of Proverbs is so important. It's normal. We don't naturally have wisdom, which means we need help getting it. That's not a problem with you. That's a problem with everyone. That's just the way we as humans are. We need help to be wise. So why should you pursue wisdom? Because you don't naturally have it. Second, one of the ways the writer of Proverbs describes life is as being like a journey. And obviously, when you have to take a journey, you need to choose which road to take. In life, you're constantly having to make decisions, and you need wisdom because those decisions are like choosing what road you're going to take in life. And the road you choose in life matters. It's going to take you somewhere. You need wisdom because you need to know how to choose the right road. If you look at Proverbs 1:15 and 16, after the title and a little introduction, the father gives his son his first set of instructions in verses 8 through 18. And in the middle of those instructions, he brings up a metaphor that he's going to use a lot throughout the book. He says, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your feet from their paths. And hear that word paths, because it comes up again in chapter 2, verse 20. So you'll walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. And so again, if you picture life as a journey, along this journey, you're constantly being asked to follow one path or another. And one path leads to life. The other path leads to death. One path is the path of the righteous. The other path is the path of the wicked. One, the narrow way. The other, the broad way. One, wisdom. The other, folly. One leads the right direction. The other leads the wrong direction, which is why we desperately need wisdom. We need wisdom because every day we are confronted with like 1 billion different decisions to make, and those decisions that we make impact where our life goes. And it's not always easy to choose the right path because there are all kinds of people out there who are trying to make the wrong choice sound good to you. I mean, if you listen to verses 10 and following of chapter 1 in Proverbs, it seems like the writer's first concern as he's teaching wisdom is to point out that we have to learn who not to listen to. He knows he has to teach wisdom because we're not naturally wise, but he's concerned as he goes to teach it because he knows there are all kinds of people recommending folly. He says, my son, if sinners entice you. And what does entice mean? It means if sinners make the wrong way sound good to you, do not consent. It is really important that we learn wisdom. 1, because we don't naturally have it. 2, because we make choices every day, and because those choices are taking our life somewhere. I wish we could really get that across. I mean, so many people don't understand. Why are you where you are? Why are you where you are? A lot of it has to do with the daily choices you make. And it's confusing to them because they're like, I didn't want to be here. Well, maybe theoretically you didn't want to be here, but on a daily basis you made decisions that brought you here. And that's part of why you need wisdom. And you need wisdom because it's hard to make the right decision. And one reason it's hard to make the right decision on a daily basis is because there's just a lot of nonsense out there that's making itself sound smarter than it really is. Third reason you need wisdom. If you do not become wise, you will make foolish decisions, and those foolish decisions are going to have massive, terrible consequences in your life. I mean, that's the thing about wisdom, and you need to understand this. Because the Bible talks a lot about grace. And we should talk a lot about grace. And we should always talk a lot about grace. Because the Bible is filled with grace, with God's undeserved kindness. And grace is not soft, but grace really wants you to know you can be forgiven. So when you make stupid decisions, grace stands up and says, listen. No matter what you've done, no matter where you've been, God is willing to forgive if you come to him in repentance, trusting in Christ. And so grace is hopeful. Grace is really, really hopeful. But you know wisdom's a little different. It's not that wisdom disagrees with grace. They're friends. And wisdom herself is really, really gracious. I mean, listen to how she speaks in verse 22 and 23 of chapter 1. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you, which is wisdom, speaking to everyone and saying, no matter who you are, I'm willing to help you become wise, which is kind. It's grace. We don't deserve that. But while grace comes to you after you've messed up and gives you hope, wisdom comes and says, man, this choice you made is going to have consequences. It's kind of like, I guess, if one of my children is running outside and starts to run across the street, and I say, stop, and they disobey and keep running, and they're hit by a car, and they're lying there. Grace will come and say, son, I forgive you. But wisdom comes and says, you know what? This is what happens when you don't listen to your daddy. And so it's true. Listen, until you die, there's hope of being forgiven. But don't be mistaken. The hope of being forgiven doesn't mean there aren't very real consequences, long-lasting consequences, life-shaping consequences for foolish decisions. Which is why in verse 24 of chapter 1, wisdom says, look, because I called and you refused to listen, I've stretched out my hand and no one is heeded. Because you've ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me, which is kind of scary. And I think helps you understand why getting wisdom is so important. The consequences of not listening are huge. And yet at the same time, the benefits of listening are huge as well. I love how wisdom puts it in Proverbs 8. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who fails to find me, injures himself, not me. Wisdom says you just injure yourself if you don't listen to me. All who hate me love death. So let me just close by telling you where you need to start. You need wisdom. That's why we're looking at Proverbs. But what can you do to get it? Here are 3 basic steps. First, Proverbs 1:7 is the key to the whole book. It's like the motto. One of the absolute most important things we learn from Proverbs is that you can't even start down the right path marked wisdom without a right attitude towards God. You see, Solomon tells us at the very beginning, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And he repeats this point in Proverbs 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Which means if you're even going to take the first step to getting wisdom, you have to work at becoming a person who fears God. And what's the fear of God? Well, that could be a long discussion in and of itself, but let me just say real simply, the fear of God has something to do with the awe of God. God's God. He's great. He's awesome. And there are a lot of people out there living as if he didn't exist, as if he were unimportant, as if he were someone small. And the problem is, if you don't get God right, you can't get anything else right either. I mean, God's amazing. And if you're not amazed by God, if God's not the center of your life, if you aren't compelled to worship God, if you can't see that he's beautiful, then you don't even have the beginning of the ability to figure out how life works. Which means the most important thing you can work on if you want to live a life that makes sense, that's good for you, that's helpful for others, that's a blessing, is the worship of God. If you want to become wise, work on your relationship with God. You can't be content with just going through life bored with God, with a small view of God. You have to get on your knees and pray, God, please help me to see who you are. God, please help me to make worshiping you a priority. You've got to spend time with God. You've got to get together with your friends and talk about what you're learning about God so that you can stir one another up to worship. And you know, it might be that some of you have to become a Christian. It's hard to make good choices if you're dead, right? And if you aren't a Christian, you don't have spiritual life. And I can get up here and talk about wisdom all day long, but it's not going to be that helpful for you because you love folly. And part of why God made folly hard is to lead you to him. And as you suffer the consequences for the choices you keep making, I pray that suffering will lead you back to God so that you can embrace him, learn the fear of God, and live. Second, how do you get wisdom? First, work on your relationship with God. Second, Proverbs 1:8, hear or listen. If there's anything that Proverbs teaches us, it's that your ear guides your life. What you listen to, who you listen to, shapes your character, and your character will end up influencing the decisions that you make. And some people have a very hard time becoming wise because they just won't listen. Proverbs 10:8, the wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin. As you go through life, wisdom and folly are constantly calling out to you. Even most of the time you go to church, hopefully you go to church, most of the time you go to church, wisdom is calling out to you. You have the opportunity to become wise, but you have to listen. You have to stop listening to nonsense. And you have to make a priority out of listening to what's true. What you listen to shapes who you are. And so if you're going to become wise, you need to work at listening to truth with an eye to applying what you're hearing to your life. And you have to work at listening to godly people. One of the best steps to becoming wise is to spend time with wise people and ask them this key question: how can I do better? I haven't always asked that question in my life, unfortunately, because it's a little scary. It's a little scary to ask someone that question because someone might tell you that you're not doing as well as you think you're doing. But if you're wise, you want to grow. And so, of course, you should ask people that question. Invite them into your life. They may see things and not say anything because they don't think you want to hear what they have to say. So don't just assume they're going to say something to you. Ask them, how can I do better? Please, how can I grow? Third, fear God. Listen to wisdom. Third, recognize, and I mean absolutely embrace this basic principle. Here it is. This could change everything. Your character impacts your behavior, and your behavior has consequences. Your character impacts your behavior, and your behavior has consequences. Who you are on the inside influences what you do on the outside, and what you do on the outside ends up directing the course of your entire life. And listen, you have to make this connection because one of the fool's basic problems is that he doesn't see it. Listen to how Solomon talks in Proverbs 1:17 as he's describing these sinners. He says, "For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird." In other words, try to catch a bird with a net. while the bird is watching you. It doesn't work, because an animal can look and see what you're doing and know the consequences if he goes into the net. And yet fools don't. They don't see the connection between their choices and what happens next. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. And I mean, if you saw someone setting an ambush to attack themselves, you would think this is a sad situation. And yet that's how foolish people live their lives. They keep making these choices that hurt them, and yet they can't see the connection. And instead they blame everyone else. And a lot of times they even end up blaming God. And so one of the steps you can take to becoming wise is not that complicated. It's stepping back and looking at your life and asking, what does my life, how it's going, reveal about my behavior? And you kind of have to be brutal. If you have all kinds of conflicts, what might that say about the way you speak? If you keep getting in trouble at your job, what does that say about the way you work? If you're continually struggling with lust, what might that say about the stuff you watch? What does your life say about how you act? And now go the next step. What does your behavior say about your heart? Because a fool is someone who doesn't see the connection between what he does and who he is, and between who he is and where his life ends up. A fool is someone who thinks, I can talk however I want, and it doesn't have anything to do with who I am. And he can't figure out why he keeps having so much conflict. And I can treat people however I want, and it doesn't say anything about me. And he can't figure out why people keep getting angry. And I can work however I want, and it doesn't have anything to do with my character, and he doesn't understand why he keeps losing his job. How about you? How about you? Proverbs. God's given us Proverbs for the purpose of giving us wisdom, which we desperately need. But how badly do you actually want it? What priority does becoming wise take in your life? If it is a priority, ask God that you fear him. Work on your relationship with God. Pursue awe. 2, make a priority out of listening to wisdom. Find a friend. Ask them how you can grow. And then 3, look at your life. Is there anything that you're complaining to God about that really, honestly, you should be repenting to God for?